The Supreme Court has just delivered a devastating blow to Keir Starmer's government, and make no mistake, this is a disaster of his own making. While hard-working Brits struggle to pay their bills, Starmer has been funneling taxpayer money into foreign deals, cozying up to EU elites, bypassing democracy, and pushing policies the public never voted for. And now, the highest court in the land has stepped in, slamming the brakes on his reckless foreign agenda, exposing his government's overreach for all to see. This isn't just a legal setback, it's a political earthquake. How bad does it have to get for the Supreme Court to intervene and stop a sitting Prime Minister from forcing through his secretive plans? Think about that. We are talking about a judicial body that typically avoids direct political confrontation. Yet here they are, calling out Starmer's government for trying to undermine the very fabric of the UK's post-Brexit sovereignty. What does that tell you? The ruling is clear. Starmer's attempt to reforge closer ties with the European Union is legally indefensible. His government has insisted that closer cooperation with Brussels is essential for economic stability. But let's be honest, that's just a smokescreen. The real objective? A backdoor attempt to reverse Brexit without public consent. And now the Supreme Court has delivered its verdict. Starmer's policies are not only politically dubious but legally unsound. For months, opposition figures and legal experts have been warning that Starmer was overstepping his authority, attempting to reshape Britain's global position without a clear mandate from the people. Now, those warnings have been vindicated. The Supreme Court has confirmed that Starmer's government has been operating in legally dubious territory, and the consequences could be devastating. Sources close to the case suggest that the ruling specifically targets legislative maneuvers Starmer's administration attempted to fast-track through Parliament. These measures, designed to align certain UK trade laws with EU standards, have now been deemed unconstitutional, effectively stopping Starmer's strategy dead in its tracks. It's a humiliating defeat, a complete derailment of his foreign policy ambitions. And it raises a fundamental question. Was this just a careless misstep, or has Starmer been deliberately working behind the scenes to reverse Brexit by stealth? The fallout is just beginning, and Labour is already in a state of total disarray. Senior party figures are furious. Some are accusing Starmer of recklessly pushing a secret EU agenda without properly considering the legal and political consequences. And many Labour MPs, who once stood firmly behind Starmer, are now beginning to question whether he's the right man to lead them into the next election. Can you blame them? The very foundation of Starmer's leadership is now under threat. Labour has long tried to dismiss concerns that Starmer was quietly working to rebind Britain to Brussels. But now the highest court in the land has confirmed what many suspected all along. This wasn't a conspiracy theory, it was happening in plain sight. And now that Labour has been exposed, their internal divisions are boiling over. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere is reportedly toxic. Heated arguments are erupting among Starmer's closest advisors, with many scrambling to find a way to salvage the government's credibility. Some within Labour are even calling for a complete overhaul of the party's foreign policy strategy, fearing that Starmer's miscalculation has handed the opposition an enormous advantage. And the timing couldn't be worse. Just as Starmer was trying to present himself as a strong and stable leader ahead of a potential general election, his credibility has been obliterated. Even his staunchest allies are wavering, with some privately admitting that this ruling could have long-term consequences for Labour's chances at the ballot box. But here's where it gets worse, because the opposition is wasting no time in capitalising on this disaster. The Conservatives and Reform UK have both seized the moment, declaring that this ruling proves, once and for all, that Starmer was never truly committed to Brexit. Prominent Brexiteers are calling it the final nail in the coffin of Starmer's credibility, demanding that he publicly admit his intentions to bring Britain back under EU influence. Nigel Farage has already issued a scathing statement, branding Starmer's secret EU agenda a direct betrayal of the British people. And Rishi Sunak? He's under immense political pressure himself, but his team sees this as an opportunity to regain the upper hand. Downing Street insiders claim that Sunak's team is already working on a strategy to hammer Starmer on this issue, portraying him as untrustworthy and willing to undermine Brexit through backdoor legal maneuvers. With a general election on the horizon, this ruling could become a defining issue, turning Starmer's miscalculation into a political disaster that could haunt him for years to come. And the worst part? This might just be the beginning. Because now, with the Supreme Court's ruling in place, Starmer faces an even bigger crisis. What happens next? Can he defy the ruling and push forward with his foreign policy regardless? Or will he be forced into a humiliating climb down, proving once and for all that his leadership is weaker than ever? One thing is certain, there is no easy way out. If Starmer chooses to defy the ruling, the consequences will be catastrophic. Ignoring a Supreme Court decision would trigger a full-blown constitutional crisis, sparking legal challenges from opposition parties, businesses, and possibly even his own MPs. Legal experts are already warning that any attempt to circumvent the court's decision would be met with immediate lawsuits, further damaging Labour's reputation and dragging Starmer's government into an endless legal battle. But if he backs down? If he accepts the ruling and abandons his foreign policy objectives? The political damage will be just as severe. It would confirm what many have suspected all along, that Starmer's leadership is weak, indecisive, and easily derailed by legal obstacles. The Conservative Party is already framing the ruling as proof that Starmer is not fit to govern, pointing out that no Prime Minister in recent history has suffered such a public legal defeat over foreign policy. And it's not just the Tories sharpening their knives. Labour insiders are now in full panic mode, scrambling to come up with a damage control strategy. Some are pushing for Starmer to issue a carefully worded statement acknowledging the ruling but downplaying its significance. Others are urging him to shift the focus onto domestic policies, hoping that voters will forget about this legal disaster by the time the next election rolls around. But deep down, even Starmer's closest allies know that this isn't something that can be brushed aside. This ruling has exposed fundamental weaknesses in his leadership. It has shown that he is not in control, that his decision-making is flawed, and that his ambitions for the UK's foreign policy are being dictated not by democratic mandate, but by secretive and legally questionable manoeuvres. And this is where the real danger lies. Because now, Starmer's opponents have an opportunity they've been waiting for, the chance to dig deeper, to uncover more about his foreign policy dealings, and to expose what other legal vulnerabilities his government might be hiding. If the Supreme Court was willing to strike down this policy, what else might they rule against in the future? Are there more legal battles on the horizon that could further destabilize Starmer's government? And perhaps the most critical question of all, was this ruling just the beginning of a much larger unraveling of Labour's agenda? The pressure is mounting, and Starmer is running out of time to respond. Every minute he delays, the crisis deepens and his grip on power weakens. Will he stand firm and fight the court's decision, risking a constitutional war that could bring down his government? Or will he retreat, admitting defeat and proving his critics right? Either way, the damage has already been done, and the road ahead is looking increasingly treacherous. The Supreme Court's ruling has shattered Keir Starmer's carefully crafted image of control, exposing a government that has not only miscalculated but has actively attempted to bypass the democratic process. This is not just a legal defeat, it is a fundamental reckoning with a Prime Minister who believed he could realign Britain with the European Union without consulting the very people who voted to leave. And now, the highest court in the land has drawn a line in the sand, declaring his strategy unconstitutional and throwing his government into complete disarray. Think about what this means. Starmer and his team didn't just make a policy mistake, they tried to sneak through legislative changes that would quietly tie the UK back to EU regulations, reversing Brexit by stealth. This wasn't a debate in Parliament. This wasn't put to the people. No, this was an attempt to alter the country's course behind closed doors, under the guise of pragmatic diplomacy. But the Supreme Court saw through the charade, and now Starmer stands humiliated, his grand strategy dead in the water. For months, critics have warned that Starmer was overstepping his authority, that his government was operating in legally dubious territory. They said he was bending the rules to push Britain closer to Brussels without public approval. And now, those warnings have been proven correct. The ruling is clear. Starmer's attempt to fast-track EU-aligned trade laws through Parliament was unconstitutional. The highest court in Britain has sent an unambiguous message. He cannot rewrite the country's post-Brexit relationship through executive overreach. But here's the real question. Was this just an oversight, a blunder by an overconfident leader? Or was this always the plan? Because if Starmer was truly trying to reverse Brexit without telling the British people, then this is not just a political scandal, it is a betrayal of democracy itself. And Labour is already falling apart under the weight of this disaster. The cracks are beginning to show. Inside the party, there is growing unrest. MPs who once stood firmly behind Starmer are now privately questioning his judgment. Senior figures are reportedly furious, accusing him of recklessly pushing a pro-EU agenda without considering the legal and political consequences. Many Labour members were already uneasy about his increasingly controversial stance on European relations. Now, those concerns are exploding into open dissent. The question Labour MPs are asking themselves is simple: can Starmer still be trusted to lead them into the next election? The Supreme Court's ruling has exposed him, not just as a leader with poor judgment, but as a politician willing to manipulate the system for his own agenda. The illusion of competence, the foundation on which he built his political brand, has crumbled. And in its place, panic, division, chaos. Behind closed doors, Starmer's closest advisors are in meltdown. Reports are emerging of furious arguments, of desperate attempts to contain the damage. Some are scrambling to shift the narrative, insisting this is just a temporary setback. Others, however, see the writing on the wall. There is already talk of a major overhaul of Labour's foreign policy, an attempt to distance the party from the mess Starmer has created. But will that be enough? Or has the damage already been done? The timing of this crisis could not be worse. With a general election looming, Starmer had positioned himself as a stable alternative to the chaos of recent years. He wanted voters to see him as the pragmatic leader Britain needed. And now, that entire strategy is in ruins. This ruling has not just exposed legal vulnerabilities in his policies, it has shattered his credibility as a leader. And of course, the opposition is wasting no time in capitalising on this disaster. The Conservatives, Reform UK, and prominent Brexiteers have all seized the moment, declaring that this ruling proves, once and for all, that Starmer was never truly committed to Brexit. Nigel Farage has already issued a blistering statement, branding Starmer's secret EU agenda a direct betrayal of the British people. And Rishi Sunak, his government, struggling in the polls, suddenly has an opening to regain ground. Insiders at Downing Street claim his team is already crafting a strategy to hammer Starmer on this issue, to portray him as an untrustworthy politician willing to undermine Brexit through backdoor legal maneuvers. And here's what makes this so dangerous for Labour: this isn't just about one policy. This ruling has opened a Pandora's box of scrutiny. If Starmer was willing to push an unconstitutional agenda on EU trade laws, what else is he hiding? What other backroom deals have been made? The Supreme Court's decision has put a target on his government, and the press, the opposition, and even some within his own party will now be looking for more weaknesses. What happens next? Starmer has no good options. If he chooses to defy the ruling and push ahead with his foreign policy objectives regardless, he risks plunging Britain into a full-blown constitutional crisis. The legal consequences would be immense: immediate lawsuits, a parliamentary revolt, and a public backlash that could be impossible to contain. Already, legal experts are warning that any attempt to circumvent the court's decision would be met with swift legal action. And if he backs down, the damage will be just as severe. A humiliating retreat would confirm the worst fears of his supporters, that he is weak, indecisive, and incapable of standing by his own policies. The Conservative Party is already framing the ruling as evidence that Starmer is not fit to govern, pointing out that no Prime Minister in recent history has suffered such a catastrophic legal defeat over foreign policy. Labour insiders, meanwhile, are in full panic mode, scrambling to come up with a damage control strategy. Some want Starmer to issue a carefully worded statement acknowledging the ruling but downplaying its significance. Others are urging him to pivot to domestic policies, hoping the public will forget about this disaster before the next election. But let's be real, this isn't something that can be brushed aside. This ruling has exposed fundamental weaknesses in Starmer's leadership. It has shown that he is not in control, that his decision-making is flawed, and that his ambitions for the UK's foreign policy are not dictated by the will of the British people, but by secretive and legally questionable manoeuvres. And this is where the real danger lies. Because now, Starmer's opponents have an opportunity they've been waiting for, the chance to dig deeper, to uncover more about his foreign policy dealings, to expose what other legal vulnerabilities his government might be hiding. If the Supreme Court was willing to strike down this policy, what else might they rule against in the future? Are there more legal battles ahead that could further destabilize Starmer's government? And perhaps the most critical question of all, Was this ruling just the beginning of a much larger unravelling of Labour's agenda? The pressure is mounting, and Starmer is running out of time to respond. Every minute he delays a clear decision, the crisis deepens, and his grip on power weakens. Will he stand firm and fight the court's decision, risking a constitutional war that could bring down his government? Or will he retreat, admitting defeat and proving his critics right? Either way, the damage has already been done. And the road ahead? It's looking more treacherous than ever. Keir Starmer's leadership is on the brink of collapse, and the chaos inside the Labour Party is reaching boiling point. The Supreme Court's ruling has not only shattered his foreign policy ambitions, it has ignited a full-scale rebellion within his own ranks. And the worst part? This isn't just about one legal defeat. This is about trust, credibility, and the growing realization that Starmer may have been leading his party, and the country, down a path that no one voted for. Senior Labour figures are furious. They are not just angry about the ruling itself, they are enraged that they have been blindsided by their own leaders' reckless decisions. Starmer has spent months operating in secrecy, pushing a pro-EU agenda under the radar, hoping that no one would notice until it was too late. Well, now the entire country has noticed. What was once dismissed as speculation, that Starmer was covertly trying to realign Britain with Brussels, has now been confirmed not by his political opponents, but by the highest court in the land. And Labour MPs are panicking. They know what this ruling means. It means Starmer is no longer the steady, competent leader he once portrayed himself to be. It means he has been caught red-handed, attempting to bypass democracy in pursuit of an agenda that most of the country does not support. And it means that the opposition now has the ammunition they need to tear him apart in the lead-up to the next election. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere is pure turmoil. Starmer's closest advisors are scrambling to contain the damage, but the situation is slipping out of their control. Reports are emerging of heated arguments, with key figures within the party openly questioning whether Starmer has what it takes to lead Labour to victory. Some are calling for a complete overhaul of the party's foreign policy strategy. Others are privately discussing something far more drastic, a leadership challenge. And here's the brutal reality: this crisis couldn't have hit at a worse time. Starmer was supposed to be Labour's ticket back to power, the man who would restore stability after years of political upheaval. He spent months positioning himself as a strong and steady hand, the pragmatic alternative to the Conservatives. And now, that entire image has been obliterated. His leadership is crumbling, his party is turning against him, and even his most loyal supporters are beginning to wonder, can Labour win an election with Starmer at the helm? The opposition is wasting no time in exploiting this disaster. The Conservatives and Reform UK have seized on the Supreme Court ruling as proof that Starmer cannot be trusted. Nigel Farage has already branded him a traitor to Brexit, while Rishi Sunak's team is reportedly crafting a strategy to hammer Starmer's credibility in the weeks ahead. And let's be honest, the Tories don't even need to try that hard. Labour is doing their job for them, imploding from the inside, as MPs scramble to distance themselves from Starmer's disastrous miscalculation. It is no longer just the usual suspects within Labour who are questioning Starmer's leadership. This crisis has rattled even his most committed allies. Some in the shadow cabinet are privately furious, believing that Starmer's obsession with pushing a quiet realignment with Brussels has now cost them their strongest advantage: public trust. They fear that Labour, once coasting towards electoral victory, has just handed the Conservatives the perfect attack line. Starmer is weak, dishonest, and willing to manipulate the system to get what he wants. And that fear is well-founded. Because what happens now? Does Starmer attempt to defy the ruling, plunging his government into a full-blown constitutional crisis? Or does he back down, humiliated, forced to admit that his entire foreign policy approach was built on legally dubious foundations? There is no good outcome here. Either he looks reckless, or he looks weak. And for a leader already struggling to connect with the electorate, this is a political catastrophe. Starmer built his entire reputation on being competent, measured, and legally precise. But the Supreme Court ruling has exposed a different reality. One where he operates in secrecy, where he pushes through policies without proper scrutiny, where he gambles with Britain's future in pursuit of his own quiet ambitions. The damage is not just legal. It is deeply political. It has destroyed the narrative that Labour has spent years trying to build. And here's where things get even worse. this ruling is only the beginning. Because now, the floodgates are open. If Starmer was willing to push the limits of legality to align Britain closer to the EU, what else has he been doing behind the scenes? What other deals, negotiations, and compromises have been made without the public's knowledge? The press, the opposition, and even some within his own party will now be looking for more. The timing is disastrous. Labour had hoped for a smooth path to the next general election, a campaign free from scandal and controversy. Instead, they are now scrambling to contain a crisis that threatens to tear them apart. Polling experts are already warning that Labour's lead could take a hit. And once public trust starts to erode, it is nearly impossible to win it back. The media is in a frenzy. Headlines are painting Starmer as a leader out of his depth, unable to control his party, let alone the country. Social media is flooded with outrage. Hashtags calling for Starmer's resignation are gaining traction. And the British public, already skeptical of political elites, is watching this all unfold with growing frustration. The Labour Party is now facing its worst nightmare, a leadership crisis on the eve of an election. And the real danger is that this could spiral into something far worse. If Labour MPs begin to believe that Starmer is a liability rather than an asset, could we see moves against him? Could this crisis lead to a battle for the leadership of the party? Because make no mistake, this is not just a temporary setback. This is a moment that defines a leader. A moment where Starmer must choose between fighting back against a Supreme Court ruling, knowing full well the legal and political risks, or admitting failure and hoping the party can survive the fallout. Either way, the damage is done. The cracks within Labour are widening, and the confidence in Starmer's leadership is fading fast. So, what happens next? Will Labour rally around Starmer? Or will the pressure become too much? Can he salvage his reputation? Or is this the moment where his leadership begins to unravel completely? And perhaps the most important question of all, has Starmer just made the fatal mistake that could cost Labour the next election? The battle for his survival has begun, and the road ahead is nothing short of treacherous. Keir Starmer is now standing on the edge of a political abyss, and the opposition can smell blood in the water. The Supreme Court's ruling has not just crippled his foreign policy ambitions, it has handed his rivals the ultimate weapon, proof that Labour's leader has been secretly pushing an agenda that directly contradicts the will of the British people. And now, the backlash is coming at him from every direction. The Conservatives wasted no time in seizing the moment. Within hours of the ruling, key Tory figures were hammering the same message. This proves that Starmer was never truly committed to Brexit. That behind his carefully crafted rhetoric of pragmatism and stability, he has been working behind closed doors to drag Britain back under EU influence. And the message is resonating. Because this isn't just political spin, this is a Supreme Court decision confirming that Starmer attempted to bypass democratic scrutiny to align UK policies with Brussels. Reform UK and the most vocal Brexiteers are going even further. Nigel Farage, always quick to capitalise on Labour's missteps, has declared this ruling the final nail in the coffin for Starmer's credibility. He is calling for Starmer to publicly admit what many now suspect, that he has been working in secret to reverse Brexit through legal manoeuvres rather than by winning a mandate from the electorate. The accusations of betrayal are growing louder, and as public anger mounts, the question is no longer whether Starmer made a mistake, it's whether he can survive it. Even Rishi Sunak, who has been struggling to regain his footing amid his own political difficulties, suddenly sees an opportunity. Downing Street sources suggest that his team is already working on a full-scale offensive to frame Starmer as an untrustworthy politician who tried to subvert Brexit through the back door. The Conservatives know that this issue has the potential to define the next general election. And if they can paint Starmer as the man who secretly tried to undo the referendum result, Labour's poll numbers could collapse faster than anyone expects. The timing of this disaster could not be worse. Labour had been enjoying a comfortable lead in the polls, with Starmer positioning himself as the stable alternative to years of Conservative turmoil. But now, that narrative has been shattered. The Supreme Court's ruling does not just weaken Starmer's political standing, it obliterates the very foundation of his leadership. And with a general election on the horizon, there is no time for damage control. Every day this crisis drags on is another day that Labour looks weaker, more divided, and less prepared to govern. And this could just be the beginning. Because now, with the ruling in place, Starmer faces an even bigger challenge. What does he do next? Does he ignore the Supreme Court's decision and push forward with his foreign policy plans regardless? If he does, he risks triggering a full-scale constitutional crisis, one that could not only destroy his leadership but plunge the country into legal and political chaos. Already, legal experts are warning that any attempt to circumvent the ruling would be met with immediate lawsuits and parliamentary rebellion. Or does he accept the ruling, back down, and admit defeat? The consequences of that option could be just as devastating. A humiliating climb down would prove his critics right, that he is weak, indecisive, and unable to see his own policies through. The Conservative Party is already framing this as evidence that Starmer is unfit to govern, pointing out that no Prime Minister in recent history has suffered such a public legal defeat over foreign policy. If he surrenders now, he risks confirming the very narrative that could cost Labour the next election. And then there is the internal battle brewing within Labour itself. The opposition's attacks are damaging, but the real threat to Starmer might come from within his own party. Senior Labour figures are furious, not just at the ruling itself, but at how Starmer allowed it to happen. Some are now openly questioning whether he is still the right man to lead them into the next election. And if that uncertainty spreads? If Labour MPs start to believe that Starmer is now a liability rather than an asset? The possibility of a leadership challenge cannot be ruled out. This is how political careers collapse, not with a single misstep, but with a series of escalating crises that erode confidence until there is nothing left. And Starmer is now dangerously close to that point. His reputation, built on the promise of steady leadership and legal expertise, has been shattered. His party, once united behind him, is showing signs of fracture. His opponents, smelling weakness, are circling for the kill. And let's not forget the public reaction. Voters who had seen Starmer as a safe pair of hands are now beginning to question whether he is any different from the politicians they have grown to despise. Social media is ablaze with accusations of dishonesty and betrayal. Polling experts are warning that Labour's lead could take a serious hit. And once public trust starts to erode, it is nearly impossible to rebuild. This is no longer just a legal battle. This is a test of survival. Every decision Starmer makes from this point forward will be scrutinized like never before. Every hesitation, every attempt at spin, every misstep could push him closer to the edge. The Supreme Court's ruling was the first blow, but the real battle is only just beginning. Will he fight back, challenging the decision and risking a constitutional crisis that could tear his government apart? Will he retreat, admitting defeat and proving his critics right? Or will Labour itself decide that it's time for new leadership before it's too late? One thing is clear: Starmer's future, and perhaps Labour's chances at the next election, now hang in the balance. And the road ahead? It's more treacherous than ever.